Hello, church. Do you guys like adventure stories? I'm kind of a big, overgrown kid at heart. I love adventure stories, and it's being an American is really a great thing for anyone who loves adventure stories, because I don't think another nation could possibly have the stories that we have that come out of our early times. I'm going to go back. We're going to go back to 1804. If you can stand just a little bit of history, I'll try to make it not too boring. 1804, some great things were going on in America, and some things that weren't all that great. But one of the things that happened in 1804 was that the Lewis and Clark expedition began. It ran for 3 years, 1804 to 1806. Now, what the Lewis and Clark expedition was, originally the United States was just a strip of land mostly along the coast. The center of the United States and the other side were all claimed by other nations, by European powers. America had engaged in something called the Louisiana Purchase, and we purchased the entire middle of the United States in one shot, but we didn't know what it was. We knew there was something there. There was something between California and New York, but no one had ever been there. No Westerners had ever been there. There was also some land on the south coast, on the California coast that was claimed by Spain, and there were some other lands that were in dispute. So what happened was the president sent Lewis and Clark and a group of men. They were all volunteers. It was a military expedition, and they sent them to basically find a good route to go to California and then to return and to see what was there, to come back with stories of what they had found, with examples of animals and vegetation, because it was completely unknown. Lewis and Clark set out, all volunteers, very much a military operation. Meriwether Lewis was a captain, and he was actually a person who knew the president. Lieutenant William Clark was also, of course, a military man, and the other people who came with him were volunteers and were just regular, I guess, privates in the Army. They did have a couple of sergeants with them also. So they began to walk and to ride and to canoe their way across the United States. As I said, it was a military operation, and there's a lot of stories. They kept a log of their travels, and there are stories that come out of discipline done to the troops. Number of people during that time for things they had done wrong received 100 lashes. One man, and this did not kill him, but I'm amazed by it, one man was sentenced by Captain Lewis to receive 400 lashes, 100 lashes a day for 4 days. This was not a touchy-feely organization. This were people living 200 years ago who were primarily mountain men and people who lived in the woods, and they were military people, and they were not imbued perhaps with some of the things that we're imbued with today. They were going on a mission for the president, and they were going to complete their mission. What's interesting is what happens to them along the trip. As they began to go out, they had to do a lot of things. They had to set up camp, they had to go get firewood, they had to go hunting, they had to go fishing. And what they began to learn about themselves was that certain men were better hunters than others. Now, they didn't know that coming in, but by sending out troops, you'd send maybe one group of guys would go out and they'd come back with 3 deer and some raccoons, and another group of guys would go out and they'd come back with 1 small bird. They began to learn that some people were just better hunters than others. So they sent the people out to hunt. Who were the best hunters? Some people were better at fishing, and when they were in the areas with the stream, some people would go doing the fishing. Not everyone, but they learned certain people were better at it than others. And this is something that, as they're traveling, that they're beginning to discern. Some people were better cooks, and I thank God for the cooks, I don't think too many people would want to eat my cooking, but there's some people who are really talented at it. So as they were going along the way, they were developing a second structure, and that structure was not just Captain Lewis giving orders. They were learning about themselves as a group as they went. Bear stories. I have to touch on the bear story with you. I know if you come from the north, maybe you have, maybe you haven't seen a black bear in your life. I've seen some black bears in the wild. They're pretty impressive. they can go 3, maybe close to 400 pounds. And it's amazing to stand there and see a 400-pound animal come out of the woods. It really is quite impressive. And these were woodsmen. They understood bears, and probably many of them had hunted and killed bears. Black bears aren't all that aggressive. You can get hurt with a black bear, but you have to go look for the black bear. And as they were heading out west, they were hearing these stories from the Indians of these great bears that were out there. And the men were actually anxious. They wanted to see one. Because, what did the Indians have? They had spears, they had bows and arrows. So a bear could be a lot of trouble for them. But the people of the expedition, they had muskets, they had sidearms. They were pretty well armed. There's an entry in the log that by the time they encountered the second grizzly bear, the men had lost all their curiosity about bears. Grizzly bears may be 3 times the size of the largest black bear that we have here. They stand 9 feet tall. And unlike a black bear, a grizzly bear will hunt you for food. And they learned that the hard way. And as they're traveling through the United States, for the first time through America, they're learning all of these things. And they're having these experiences together, being attacked by bears, of dealing with different Indian tribes. And they're changing on their journey. Along the way, they hired a Frenchman who came with them. They hired a Frenchman as an interpreter. So now you have people from Lewis and Clark were educated men. As I said, Lewis knew the president. They had many people who were just the privates in the Army, I guess in 1804, were not probably always the most educated of people. They're just people who were willing to take a gun and fight or follow rules and needed some money. So you had really a very diverse group. Then a Frenchman comes into their group. Along the way, they picked up also a pregnant Indian lady. And I have to ask you, does anyone know who that was? Tell me. Oh, God bless you. Sacagawea. I was hoping somebody would know her. We're really told of 2 Indian women, I think, in our history. One is Pocahontas, and the other is Sacagawea, and she has a wonderful story. She gave birth along the way. She was with the men, and she was helping them guide through areas where I guess she had probably never been before either, but she was a good liaison with the Indians. So you have this group of you and me and a little bit of everybody, a Frenchman, a Native American woman, a baby she just had along the way, and this group is moving out. It's still a military expedition, though, right? It's still under the control of Captain Lewis, and very much under the control of Captain Lewis. If Captain Lewis wanted to have you flogged to death, he had that authority and he could do it. But there was something happening together to them as a group. They were relearning some things that we once knew. This is interesting to me. Now, in August 1805, there's an entry in the journal where Captain Lewis writes that he wants to spend the rest of his life helping people. What a change. I'm not saying that he wasn't a godly man, but he was very much a very strict officer. And he's coming through, and as they're going together and they're learning these things, they're learning to work together, they're learning not to assign jobs, but some of us just do different things better than others, and they're naturally doing it. And by using this, they're surviving in their journey. This really ends to me, and I love this story. I mean, if you ever want to get excited about reading an adventure tale, or also Ken Burns, I think, did the Lewis and Clark expedition on videos. It's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful tale. I can't even touch the beginning of it. But there's one point I really want to touch, because there's one point in the true Lewis and Clark story that really touched me. They get from their jump-off point, which I think might have been St. Louis. They started as far west as they could initially, for obvious reasons, and then they were heading across who knew where. They finally make it in October, November, they make it in October or November of 1805, they make it to the Pacific Ocean. That's wonderful, but it's not the best time of the year, because they were pretty far up north, and they were left with a decision. Now, earlier in their travels, they had gotten to a branch in the Missouri River, and they didn't know which way to go. Everybody disagreed with Lewis and Clark. They went the way Lewis and Clark said to go. As it turned out, they were right. that Lewis and Clark had chosen the right branch of the river, but there was no discussion. They were in charge, and that's how it went. When they got to the ocean, by the time they had gotten to the ocean, they were a different group than the group that left in the beginning of 1804. Because when they hit the ocean, they had to make a decision. The winter was coming. They were pretty far up north. And the decision was, which way do we go? They knew that if they went far enough, followed the coast far enough south, that they would eventually hit some kind of Spanish colonies, and that they might be able to winter with the Spanish colonies. Problem was, Spain had actually sent its own expedition to try to find the Lewis and Clark expedition and kill them, because they didn't want America trying to claim this land. Although we had bought it from France, they didn't want us in there. They were contesting it. That military expedition never actually met Lewis and Clark, but here they are, they're standing on the beach at the Pacific Ocean, and they have a decision to make. Are we going to stay here? Are we going to go back to that last Indian tribe where we could winter, but it would be a very hard winter? Are we going to take our chances and head south and see if we can find a settlement that would be friendly to us? They had a life and death decision that would have affected everybody in the group. They had changed so much during this period of time, working together, traveling together, dealing with each other's good things and their faults. They had spent so much time together that they made a decision that is really very much a Christian decision and very much an American decision. Do you know how they decided which way they were going to go? Did they flip coins? Did Lewis tell them? Does anyone know how they did it? I'm sorry? Or you're batting 100 today, Terry. They took a vote. Now that's outrageous, isn't it? That this military expedition took a vote. But you know what's more outrageous? Captain Lewis had one vote. Captain Clark had one vote. The sergeant that they had, the sergeants, let me not go into this the wrong way. The sergeants, they had one vote. The troopers, who were uneducated men, who had walked across the United States with them, they had one vote. The Frenchman, who wasn't really even part of them but was along with them, he had one vote. And Sacagawea had one vote. They came from a period, I'm going to mention this without going too much into it, there was also a slave that one of the people brought with them. And he was allowed one vote. It was unheard of. It was 1804. Women couldn't vote, couldn't think of voting. Indians couldn't vote, period. Male or female. Just shortly before that in the United States, it was only men, it was only white men, and it was only affluent white men, if you go back 20 years prior, who were allowed to vote, and that was it. Voting was limited to landowners. What on earth happened to them along that trip? I think it's one of the really the great moments in Americanism, the way they decided to do this. You know, something happened to them that was not true the day they left St. Louis, but that was true when they hit the ocean. Okay, so here we are. It's, almost 12:15 on a Sabbath, and I'm up here talking about Lewis and Clark. Is that a weird Sabbath? But do you see a reason for it? Do you see why Lewis and Clark might be a good way to segue into it will be a short sermon. It won't be too long. But look at what they had found. Look at what they became. I see in Lewis and Clark, I see our church. I see our church today, and I see the Christian church, the history of the Christian church, because what did we come out of? When in the book of Acts, what did we come out of? What kind of leadership did they have? Were they taking votes and talking things over together? Well, they did have the Sanhedrin, which gave that appearance, but if you follow the trial of Christ, the Sanhedrin was completely ineffective. What happened was, it was what the high priest and a small group of former high priests and their families, it's what they wanted done was what was done. And if you were a Jewish fisherman and you disagreed with them, there was no such thing as disagreeing with them. There was no such thing as discussing it with them. They might condescend to tell you how things are, but there was no real freedom. There was no personal freedom. You were told how to do it, and that's what our church came out of. Our church came out of a background, and that's what Jesus was born into. He was born into a background where you were told what to do. But by the time you get into Acts, I'm going to read a couple of things from the book of Acts. I chose Acts 15. I'm going to read Acts 15, verses 24 and 25. For as much as we have heard that certain which went out from us have troubled you with words, subverting your souls, saying, ye must be circumcised and keep the law, to whom we gave no such commandment. Notice the we gave no such commandment. It seemed good to me, no, it seemed good to us, being assembled in one accord, to send chosen men unto you, with our beloved Barnabas and Paul. What you see is in Acts, very much. I mean, you have the apostles there. Do you think that if Peter said it will be this way, or John will be this way, that anyone would stand and say, no, John, you don't really understand what Jesus wanted? Do you think so? They easily could have wrested control. But they didn't. They chose not to. How did they act? They acted together as a group. They respected each other, they discussed it with each other, and that's how they made their decisions. I'm reading from Acts 2. This is the choosing of Stephen as one of the first deacons. Acts 6, let me get this right. Acts 6, verses 2 and 3. Then the 12 called the multitude of the disciples unto them, and said, it is not reason that we should leave the word of God and serve tables. Wherefore, brethren, look ye out among you 7 men of honest report, full of Holy Ghost and wisdom, whom we may appoint over the business. Now, they had leaders. They were giving people particular jobs to do. Go find 7 people who are going to be good at this, who are going to do it honestly. But Paul didn't dictate that to the council in Jerusalem. They were dealing with here, they were dealing with, the 12 called the multitude of disciples. Everybody in there and around there, and every Christian was called. They had a church meeting. Who are we going to pick to do this? Who do you think would be good? Who could we trust? Who would be especially good for this job? I think that's wonderful. I really do. Like that early church came out of a series that was very much top-down. We will tell you how to do it, and you'll do it the way we told you. Everyone who's in this room today, whether you're I'm assuming whether you're from an Adventist background, whether you're from another background, virtually everyone who's been in this room today was born into that. That was not the history in the early Adventist church, but by the time the 30s, 40s, 50s rolled around, we had pastors assigned to churches, and they were basically, some of them were very humble men, some of them were very godly men, but they were in charge. We didn't elect them. They were in charge, they were placed here, and that's what we've known, most of us, all our lives. We've never really fully been able to experience walking across America together. But I think that's what we're trying to do. I think that's what we're trying to start to do, if I understand what we're attempting. When we call it NCD, Natural Church Development, it goes under different buzzwords. And I don't buy everything that I'm being told by people. But that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to relive that experience. We're here. Why? Why would we want to do it? Because we want to send the best evangelists out to do the evangelism. Right? We want to have people do the things that they do best. Because I'll tell you, it's much more enjoyable to do it when you're doing something that you love to do and that you feel you do well than it is when you're doing a job you've been given and it's not really suiting you, but this is what you've been given, so that's what you're going to do. How, on the Louise and Clark expedition, how did they learn who were the good hunters, who were the good cooks, who were the good fishermen, who was good at setting up a camp? How did they learn? What do you think? What do you think how they learned? Did they know that, gee, I have this talent? Maybe some of them did. Trial and error. So a lot of different people, I think they started with 29 people, and they picked up a few along the way, and they lost one. But a lot of different people were doing a lot of different things, and from experience they found out how it worked and what we do best. We're really very much trying to have that experience here. We're trying to walk across America together in our little church. We're breaking things up a little. We want everyone to have a chance to teach Sabbath school. We're trying to break up the platform. For years what we've done, basically the elders are on the platform. Maybe a head deacon would be on the platform. Why? I don't know why. It's because it's what we got used to doing. It's easier. It's easier on everyone. You don't have to think so much. You can just sit back and listen to a sermon. But we're trying to break it up. You've noticed we've had a whole line now of different people coming up and taking over parts of the platform. Eventually, we'd like to see everybody take over a part of the platform. I don't have to be on the platform being the person to give you the welcome. We're trying to break it up, and we're trying to do it for a reason. A couple of reasons. One is, when they got to the Pacific Ocean, they had a lot more ownership in that group that they were part of than they did when they started out. I think they did. I think they had a lot more emotional ownership. They weren't just assigned to a job. They didn't just volunteer. They were part of that group who made that trip together. And they were doing it by doing what each one did the best. They found it out how. They didn't take a survey. They didn't take a survey to learn your talents, to learn your spiritual gifts. They tried it. And they found out, gee, this isn't really for me, but I really like doing that other thing. I just like doing that job. It was for me. I think that's the way we need to proceed. We need to have this, and that's really kind of the direction that we're headed in. Proverbs 15:22, without counsel, purposes are disappointed, but in the multitude of counselors they are established. The multitude of counselors, we deciding things together. I learned something on Friday. I've been trying to understand natural church development. I really like an awful lot the parts of it that I've heard. I know the church has voted to try to adopt this. I know the board voted to try to adopt this. Now we have to figure out what on earth we've adopted. I was reading this on, let's see if I can find my page. I was reading this on Friday. I was off from work on Friday, gave me a chance to read, and I learned something really weird about myself that I never knew. I thought I was German and English. I thought back in my ancestry there was a little French. It turns out I'm Indonesian. I didn't know that. But I'm reading in the book, and what they're talking about is different cultural views of church, different cultural views of how we organize ourselves, because we are very, very culturally diverse. And if we handle that properly, it's a tremendous strength. It's a tremendous strength if we go about this the right way. Well, this is why I think I'm Indonesian. Let me see what it says here. Because I just agreed with this completely. It says here, and they're talking about different methods, different cultural ways of approaching things. For example, the role of the traditional Indonesian village elder is not to dictate decisions, as it might appear to the outside world, to Westerners, because they're talking about the Greco way, the Western way of hierarchy of how to do things. They say it was not that, but to lead in a way that encourages dialogue and leads to consensus. Not forces consensus, not shuts anyone up, not forces one view upon the other, but to allow everyone to talk about it, because that's where the ideas come from. You can't, we've often looked, and a new pastor's coming in, boy, I hope he's got a good vision for the church, boy. We can really move ahead if we get a pastor with a good vision for the church. I wonder what this new pastor's vision is going to be. It's got to be our vision. How many people do we have here? Maybe 60 people sitting in here. It's the summer, so some of our people are away. We have a lot more than that, actually, when we do get a full church. Everybody has an idea. Everybody has insight into something. We have to be able to talk. We have to be able to listen. And we have to understand that There's no one person who's going to stand up here, be the big bad leader, and come and give the church the vision. One of the aspects of NCD that really there are a couple of things about it that I like, and there's a couple of things I don't. But one of the things that really charmed me, I guess, was the idea of the church can be whatever the church wants to be. Now, I'm not talking about Adventist beliefs. We're not giving up the Sabbath or anything like that. But there is a tremendous difference between how churches reach out, how they function with each other inside the church. The church can be whatever the church and the members really want it to be. Health in the church, I think, and I've always thought, comes from not having a great leader. Health comes from everybody doing their part, from us working together as the early church did, as they did in the books of Acts, talking about things. Doesn't mean some people weren't leading out in certain things. We can't have everybody leading out in the choir program because that's noise. That's not a choir. And we understand that. But in how we function as a church, in the ownership that we have in this church, it has to be that same ownership that they had when they were at the Pacific Ocean. Everybody's got one piece. That's who we are really aiming to be, I think. Sometimes we say we're aiming to be that, but things get in the way. Sometimes, we get in very close cliques, and it's very comfortable, and it's very easily, you're very easily defended when you're surrounded by 3, 4, 5 close friends, and you hang out, and you always move together. But it's not always the best thing for the church. It's not always the best thing for people who might be coming into the church who want to come in and get to know us. Because that's really what we have to sell. We have Jesus Christ as they see him in us. That's going to be the first thing that they see, us. How do we work together? I hope I haven't NCD'd everybody to death at this point. I know we've been on this. I know we've been on this for a long time, and I know I was talking to Pastor last night, and I don't think either one of us fully have our arms around exactly everything, every place that we're going. But one place we're going is to be a principle-based church. I believe in the law. I believe in the 10 Commandments. But before the law and before the 10 Commandments comes the 2 principles on which everything's hung. Love of God and love of each other. Whenever we depart from principles and we follow too closely the law, what happens is we follow our understanding of the law to the point where we lose sight of the principle. It's the principle that's important. The law just helps us follow it. It's the purpose of the law to help us follow those 2 principles. It's the thing we struggle with. We ran a little late today. I'm just going to give you one short story. Can you stand an accounting story? Because I know fewer things will wake everybody up in this church than to give you a good old accounting story. Right? Maybe not. I'm going to try anyway. You heard of generally accepted accounting principles? GAAP. If you prepare a financial statement, it has to be prepared in accordance with generally accepted accounting laws. No, not laws, principles. But for years in the U.S., the accounting literature has said we've taken a wrong turn. We've made up all of these laws, and it doesn't work. What we need to return to is the way the Europeans do it, which is you follow the principle. There's a principle of full disclosure, telling the reader everything the reader needs to know to make a decision. That's the principle. There's a principle of conservatism, which means you don't anticipate any gains, but you provide for any losses. They're principles. They're great guiding principles. We made up a whole bunch of laws, and the result of one of those laws was Enron. You remember what happened at Enron? Enron was the great collapse that occurred. It took down one of the accounting firms. Arthur Andersen went down. But when they tried Arthur Andersen, they were found innocent. Because Arthur Andersen followed the law, the accounting rules, and they didn't divulge from them, but they ignored the principle. And because of that, this major company went out of business without giving anyone warning. Companies are allowed to go out of business, but the financial statements are supposed to give you warning, and they didn't, because they didn't follow the principles. they followed the rules. And the rules said, if you had an entity that you have a less than 1% ownership in, you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to worry about it for purposes of preparing the financial statements. What the issue was, there was great amounts of debt that were owed that didn't show up anywhere on the financial statements. The reason was what they didn't prepare for when they did the law. Enron went out and they opened up an entity, a 1% entity. Somebody else owed 99%, Enron owned 1%. And then after they opened up that entity, they opened up 999 more. They had 1,000 of them. It wasn't prepared for in the law. And I'm just saying this for a reason. I know that accounting is not really maybe a big thing, but it's a closing idea, and it's an idea between what we really care about, what the principles are, and what our laws are, and how we're interpreting them. And that's where we're trying to head, people. If I understand where we're going, where we're trying to head is we're trying to cross America together for the first time on foot together. We're trying to get to the point together where the principles are what lead us and not the laws. Now, listen, I thank you for putting up with another little brief NCD sermon, and thank you very much, Church.